polygamy is something that God actually worked in covenantally through the family of Jacob to bring about the redemption of his children, right? Like, he's not just not condemning it, he's like working with it as a vehicle of redemption.
The vast majority of the historical evidence we have points to polygamy originating in a revelation given to Joseph Smith.
How did this practice take place for decades and then suddenly stop in 1890? Hello, Saints. My name is Jeff. I am a pastor in Utah exploring everything I can about the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and there has been some recent dust-up online on a topic that I've been wanting to touch on for a pretty long time, since really the beginning of this channel. And it's on the topic of polygamy. So I have Dr. Scott Woodward from BYU, Idaho.
Yeah, great to be with you, Jeff.
Thanks for being here. And I have Dr. Casey Griffiths from BYU in Provo. Is that right?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay, awesome. And both of you guys teach in the religion department. Is that accurate?
Yep, that's right.
Okay, so you're going to help me do the heavy lifting here, answer all my questions about polygamy, plural marriage, and all that comes with that.
Bring it on.
We're excited to have a discussion.
Yeah,
Okay.
let's do it.
Let's dive in. Help me understand as a Protestant evangelical where this very controversial and polarizing concept of and the practice of plural marriage and polygamy sits within your tradition. There's perception, there's misperception, there's a bit of a fogginess when it comes to where this sits within your tradition.
I think you're right that for people that know anything about us, polygamy is kind of the elephant in the room. I think it's the first thing that gets brought up whenever you tell anybody that you're a Latter-day Saint.
How many moms do you have?
Yeah, how many moms do you have? Yeah, do your parents practice polygamy and stuff like that? And we should make two things clear. Number one, the church doesn't practice plural marriage. It hasn't for over a century. I'm talking about the church we belong to, which is the mainline church, the big one. The second thing is the majority of the church never practiced plural marriage either. The majority of people in the church were monogamous, even in Joseph Smith and Brigham Young its time. But they did believe in the principle of plural marriage, and we still believe in it to a certain degree today. At least the idea is based in this concept that's really meaningful to us of eternal relationships. Marriage and family relationships going on to the eternity. So conceptually it's tied to that, but maybe you want to give them the history behind how it developed.
Yeah, sure. The history is that it begins with Joseph Smith's project of revising the Bible, the Joseph Smith Translation Project. And it doesn't take too long when you're reading Genesis before you hit your first polygamist, right? You get Abraham. Mm-hmm. He has Sarah, Hagar, and Keturah, right? 3 wives. Isaac, we think, is monogamous.
Okay.
And Jacob, clearly polygamous, right?
Yeah. And even did Lamech, didn't he?
That's true.
Lamech. He preceded Abraham.
But he's a bad guy, so we don't.
So we don't talk about
yeah.
Okay.
We don't talk about that.
No, Lamech's he's the first polygamist, but he's rotten. So we're like, of course he'd be polygamous, right? But then you get to Abraham.
Yeah.
And it starts to rock your paradigm a little bit, right?
Sure.
And then Jacob especially, because the house of Israel is the family through whom God's covenant promises are going to be fulfilled. So it's like clearly God is in this, right? Or is using it, or is working through it, or however you want to frame it. But Joseph Smith, when he's coming to those passages, is starting to ask questions to the Lord, like, how is this justified morally? Like, these seem to be righteous people, and yet they're engaged in a practice that seems immoral. And from that wrestle comes Doctrine and Covenants 132 that we have in our scripture still today. And so the first couple of verses walk through that. It's like, well, since you've asked about the justification for not only Abraham, but Jacob and David and Solomon and Moses, and there's several polygamists that are righteous people. Since you asked, Joseph, I'm going to explain the law. And then he goes into it. And so that's the impetus. And we're thinking it's 1831 from the earliest sources.
Oh, okay. So that's
super early.
Earlier than I realized.
Yeah.
Because the church was established in 1830.
Yeah.
But I'm guessing the first time that it sort of comes up in Joseph Smith's prophetic ministry is when he's translating the Book of Mormon. The Book of Mormon and a later revelation Joseph Smith received suggests that plural marriage is the exception and not the rule. So in Jacob chapter 2 of the Book of Mormon, the Nephites are engaging in plural marriage, and Jacob condemns the practice specifically, but then adds a provision where he says, if the Lord commands otherwise to raise up seed, then it can be allowed. Then the second data point is the 49th section of the Doctrine and Covenants, where Joseph Smith receives a revelation concerning the beliefs of a group called the Shakers, who don't believe in marriage, or at least think marriage is a lesser form of existence. Right. And that revelation states specifically that each man should have one wife, and that marriage is part of the purpose for the creation of the earth as well. So I guess his first encounter is that it's there, it's in the Bible. The passage in Jacob actually deals with the fact that there's biblical polygamy, specifically that David and Solomon practice polygamy, but seems to cite it as the exception and not the rule. And then when it's introduced fully, which is later on in the late 1830s, but really fully in the Nauvoo period in the 40s, it's introduced to a small group of people, and then gradually expanded and made known to the church. And so from then until the latter part of the 19th century, 1890 is when future plural marriages are outlawed by the church. They do allow people to stay in relationships they were already in.
Sure.
We practice it and we believe in it. And even if Latter-day Saints aren't involved in a plural marriage, they still defend the principle.
I remember reading in a biography of Joseph Smith that as he was sort of processing through some of this, that there was reluctance on his part as he was sort of processing what he felt was being revealed to him regarding plural marriage.
Yeah.
Is it widely believed, though, and is it settled that Joseph eventually did enter into plural marriage relationships and covenants with individuals beyond his wife Emma?
I think the most orthodox view, and by the way, it's not just orthodox, the vast majority of the historical evidence we have points to polygamy originating in a revelation given to Joseph Smith, and that Joseph Smith was the one that instigated the system. And when we say historical evidence, we're talking information from Joseph Smith's contemporaries, people that worked closely with him, people like William Clayton, who was his private secretary, who recorded the revelation that Scott made reference to, and then the women that were involved in plural marriage and the other disciples. Because in Nauvoo, Joseph Smith just doesn't enter into plural marriage himself. He introduces it among a small group of associates, and they in turn make it a general thing in the church in the 1850s. And so the evidence surrounding Joseph Smith practicing plural marriage is I would say, almost overwhelming.
Very robust.
But there were public statements made in Nauvoo where Joseph Smith condemned the practice of plural marriage, and we can either look at that as, well, he's saying that because it's not a public practice, and he's got to protect the people that are practicing it. When charges of plural marriage are made public, Joseph Smith is dead 20 days later. It's an incredibly explosive topic.
Right, because there's a direct tie to claims of polygamy and the Nauvoo expositor.
Yeah.
And his response to that, and then his incarceration in Carthage.
Yeah, so I mean, it's under the surface of all those things there. The other possibility is that when Joseph Smith made those public statements, he was explaining the public position of the church, which was monogamy during that time, and plural marriage was being introduced among a small group. And so some people have taken those public statements and then their own kind of feelings about plural marriage and tried to build a historical case that Joseph Smith didn't practice plural marriage. And I just think that the overwhelming amount of evidence speaks against that.
And there's no question as it pertains to Brigham Young continuing the practice.
Yeah. When we get to Utah, Brigham Young in 1852 makes the practice public, and it's well known and generates an incredible amount of controversy throughout the United States that still kind of lingers today. And it's publicly known.
It's one of the reasons for the Republican Party in our government. Like it was founded to fight against the twin relics of barbarism, right? Slavery and polygamy, specifically targeting those out in Utah.
And the other thing that doesn't get brought up is the government wasn't just targeting plural marriage. They were worried about the overlapping between ecclesiastical and political power that existed in Utah. And I'm sorry, they don't advertise that as much because it's easier to get people on board if you bring up an offensive moral practice.
Well, the shorthand explanation from non-members I have heard is Brigham Young took Latter-day Saints out to unincorporated territories so that they could practice polygamy and be left alone.
I mean, that's not entirely untrue, but it's a real simplification of things. I mean, first of all, saying Brigham Young chose to come here is a is a maybe misdirect. They didn't exactly choose to come here as much as they were forcibly removed or told that they would be wiped out if they didn't come here.
Yeah, and I think what someone's getting at when they say that is that's why he went to an area that at the time was just territorial. It wasn't a safe, so that they could not be pushed out any further. At least so they thought.
Yeah, and Latter-day Saints are some of the most patriotic Americans around today, but back then they were deeply disillusioned with the American government and the fact that even before they began practicing plural marriage, the federal government and state governments had shown an unwillingness to intervene on their behalf. There's a lot of statements made by Joseph Smith and later Brigham Young that they felt like the principles of the American government were good, but that they refused to actually defend things like the free exercise of religion. And they saw plural marriage as something that was covered under the free exercise of religion as well, that if it wasn't harmful and it was consensual, that it should be protected under the First Amendment, but they felt like the government had failed to live up to its obligations. So part of the reason why they come to Utah is to sort of found their own country, but when they get here, the United States has already annexed this part of the country. And so from then on, they do try to cooperate and make a legal case under the system that they should still be protected by the First Amendment.
Sure. So now that we've sort of set the backdrop historically, what does that mean today then? I know that a lot has happened since the 1850s, but what is the current church position on the issue? I know you said that the church does not practice it, but how do members understand its placement in the history of the church and the implications that it has in even some of the principles that you use? I want to talk about that more in just a second, but the principles surrounding plural marriage and the implications that it has in even the afterlife that you touched on in just a second. Because I'm saying that because from a Protestant evangelical standpoint, it's kind of like, yes, like there were polygamists in the Bible. That was descriptive, not prescriptive, and never turned out right. And I'll touch on this more in just a second, but that it seems to us that the principles taught around marriage is one man, one woman. So that's when I'm used to that paradigm. Is that in sync with how a Latter-day Saint might understand marriage, specifically based on the fact that polygamy is part of the heritage?
Yeah, I think most Latter-day Saints today, I think we are the authorities on what most Latter-day Saints think.
We're totally mainline. We're mainstream.
No, that's not true. But I think the general thrust is like we're aware that it happened in our past. It's an uncomfortable topic to talk about.
Is it?
Yeah. And so we don't know what to do with it, and so we don't talk about it. But there's still like a lingering, almost discomfort, almost bordering on fear for some members. I've noticed that, especially women, that maybe this could A, come back one day, or B, in the afterlife, it might be a thing that we're going to have to learn how to deal with. And so I'd say that's on the kind of the extreme. And then most members don't think about it. But I think we're all pretty aware of it.
Seems like everybody's aware of it.
Yeah.
And I would say the way that you phrased it as to one man and one woman, most church members would agree with that. Okay. We do differ with Protestants in that we believe that marriage relationships last beyond this life.
Yeah.
And that's maybe an entry point to understand plural marriage, which is if you believe in eternal marriage, then plural marriage is always going to be present in some form. Like I'll ask my classes, who's the last president of the church to be sealed to more than one person? And the answer is the current president of the church, Russell M. Nelson. His first wife, Dancel White, passed away in 2005. They had 10 children together. A few years later, he was married to Wendy Watson. And so technically, he's sealed to two people. And whether or not that results in a plural marriage relationship in the next life or not is up to them and their own consent. But we do believe, at least in principle, that eternal marriage, and because of the messy complications that surround marriage and family in general, get carried on into the next life. Now, again, like Scott mentioned, I think the lingering question over it is, was it oppressive to women? It seems like that's the big fear that comes up a lot.
I've heard that a couple times as I've tried to broach the subject with some individuals. One in particular who I months ago asked if they would be willing to discuss plural marriage on the on Hello Saints, and their response was, I'm actually currently pausing any conversation on this because there are too many women within my faith context, as in Latter-day Saints, that are very much struggling with this issue. And I don't know if I'm at a place to be even publicly speaking on it right now. So when it comes to the women in the church, it really is something for a lot of them that, as you're saying, leaves them unsettled.
I think that's the second elephant in the room. Like the first is that it happened in our past, and the second is what does this mean for the future?
Right.
Or the present. And I think all three can inform each other. Like when I teach my classes about plural marriage, one of the things that I try to do is provide a voice for the women who practice plural marriage. Because a lot of the historical discussions just kind of brush them to the side or treat them like they were duped into it. And most of these women, especially the ones that entered into the early plural marriages in Nauvoo, were very vocal about how they felt about it. Some of them wrote books and defenses of plural marriage, and most were willing to share their feelings. Now, there were others that participated in court cases because sometimes the legality of plural marriage became an issue. And so I think any exploration of the subject is sort of unfair unless you're listening to what they have to say.
I think it's fair to say that Joseph Smith's wives are the world's leading experts on Joseph Smith's polygamy, right? Like you'd want to listen to the women, and then those who go out from there, right, with Brigham Young's wives and so on. Like the women that were involved, like have a voice, and they've expressed a lot. Like you said, they left a lot on record that deserves to be carefully considered. I was reading, for instance, in the 50 Years of the Relief Society publication that the church did. They have this amazing documentation of women going to Washington, D.C. when the government was threatening to take away the vote from women here as part of the Edmunds-Tucker Act to take down the church institutionally, right, to disenfranchise the church. And they were going out to fight for the right to vote. But in doing that, they were defending polygamy, like very articulate women defending polygamy to Congress. Like amazing documentation. Their voices need to be heard.
Yeah, and I want to recognize the irony in two men mansplaining women's perspectives. All I can say is there's tons of material that's been put online. A lot of it by the church. They published, for instance, Eliza Snow's writings and Ellen B. Wells. Eliza Snow was a plural wife of Joseph Smith, who later on became a plural wife of Brigham Young and was sort of the female counterpart to Brigham Young during the Utah period. So Brigham Young was sometimes spoken of as the high priest of the church, and Eliza as the high priestess.
Oh, okay.
And so this is a woman who is incredibly smart, incredibly articulate. She writes a book of poetry that's about this thick. She writes some of the most meaningful hymns that we still use in the church. And she was very willing to talk about the introduction of plural marriage and how it worked and how she felt about it. And again, it's a disfavor if we don't listen to what they had to say and how they felt entering into it, especially because some of them make some really poignant statements. I'm thinking of like Zina Huntington, who was, again, married to Joseph Smith and then married to Brigham Young, saying that when the principle was presented to her, she recognized she would be seen as a dishonorable woman. But she was entering into it because of her faith and her commitment to God, because she saw it as a commandment from God and a revelation given to Joseph Smith. And it's just a little unfair that the conversation mostly centers around male leaders of the church without listening. And I hope, at least with my female students, it's been helpful that in a class where we discuss it, we spend at least half the time saying, here's a woman, here's how it was introduced to her, here's how she felt about it. And then here's a man, here's how it was introduced to him, here's how he felt about it. The other thing, too, that's interesting is that this idea of plural marriage, at least in principle, does exist for women too. In the last few years, the church's policy has changed so that a woman can be sealed to multiple men as well. So there's a divine form of polyandry that exists as well. And it's this idea, right, that if she has, let's say you're doing family history work for your grandparents, your great-great-grandparents, and you find out that great-grandma was married to husband A and he died, so she got married to husband B and then he died, and she married to husband C and he died. The question is, who do you seal grandma to? Mm-hmm. And the answer is all three of them. Just seal her to all three, and that'll get worked out in the next life somehow, right? Yeah.
So naturally, what comes to my mind then is Jesus' conversation with the Sadducees. Mm-hmm. Whenever they ask that very question, if somebody's married to multiple,
whose wife will she be?
Whose wife? And to me, he seems to quite abruptly and directly knock that line of thinking down to say, well, that's not. I know that he uses very specific wording, and I'll just paraphrase, but that's not exactly how things work in the spiritual realm in the next life. How does a Latter-day Saint hold that then? If there's provision being made for sealings that go beyond this life, when it seems that Jesus is quite directly saying you're not given into marriage. It's just like the angels, where that relational dynamic is not part of the eternal reality.
Yeah, I mean, that very verse is dealt with in the D&C 132 Revelation.
Okay.
Do you want me to pull it up real quick?
Yeah, that'd be super helpful. Yeah.
Doctrine and Covenants 132, verse 14 through 16. I won't read the whole thing, but I'll paraphrase a little. The context is that anything that's not under the sealing keys. It hasn't been sealed. Any covenants, contracts, bonds, promises, obligations, vows. There's this big list. If they're not sealed by the sealing keys of Elijah, then they will not persist beyond the resurrection.
Okay.
That's the premise of what he's about to say. He says, so therefore, if a man marry a wife in the world, and he doesn't marry her by me or by my word, and he covenants with her, so long as he's in the world and she with him, and their covenant and marriage are not of force when they are dead, when they're out of the world. Therefore, they're not bound by any law when they're out of the world. And then this language, therefore, when they're out of the world, they neither marry nor are given in marriage, but are appointed angels in heaven, which angels are ministering servants, to minister for those who are worthy of a far more and an exceeding and eternal weight of glory. So we would say, in response to the Jesus and the Sadducees and they're trying to trap him, right? Again, it's a classic trap for Jesus. Like, so what about that? And our reading of that would be, well, they're asking about a situation that's not sealed under the sealing keys. The keys he spoke of in Matthew 16, that whatsoever you bind on earth can be bound in heaven. Their little trick, their little trap was not covered by that particular clause, if you will, right? They're just talking about a secular marriage or a traditional marriage, but not a sealing marriage. Does that make sense?
So there's a difference between marrying someone just in the normal course of relationship versus going into that covenant sealing within what is now practiced in like Latter-day Saint temples.
Yes.
Okay.
The premise here is that it's not that God is trying to create like some capricious law that, if you don't do it exactly this way, then you can't be with your spouse forever. Sorry. It seems to be exactly the opposite. That God is saying there's only one way that you can survive, that relationships can survive the dissolution that's naturally going to happen, that happens for all things, including relationships. Mm-hmm. And that is if it's sealed by my word and by my law. And so that's why we get married in the temple. That's why we do it for the dead. We're trying to get everyone that opportunity to have it covered under the sealing keys so that it can persist in the resurrection, because anything that's not under that will eventually come to an end after the resurrection. There's only one way to make it persist. That's the logic of D&C 132.
So let me see if I understand this correctly, then I'll paraphrase.
Yeah.
Essentially what he's saying is, well, of course, in the next life, people aren't given into marriage.
Yeah.
That happens in this life, and the sealings must take place in this life, which is why it doesn't take place in the next. Is that accurate, what I'm saying?
I think so, yeah.
There can be exceptions to that. Not everybody will get married in this life. But another thing I would add is the passage in Matthew is one data point, and as a pastor, you understand the danger in tying everything to one scripture. Early Latter-day Saints were very, very concerned with the whole Bible. And one of the things I mentioned in my class, because sometimes Latter-day Saints summarize our religion by saying we're the New Testament church restored, was that early Latter-day Saints were very, very tuned into the Old Testament as well. And the promises that were made to Abraham were also made to Sarah, Isaac and Rebekah, Jacob and his wives as well. They saw as a confirmation that family relationships were really important and would endure into the next life. But anybody that's worked with any group of people for any extended period of time as a pastor or bishop or whatever will suddenly realize that family relationships are really messy.
Yeah.
They're messy here, and we believe that they persist into the next life, but that creates kind of a mess.
Yeah, it does.
Yeah.
For sure. And just to kind of come at it from our angle, I'll touch on that one first. We do believe that family relationships can persist into the next life. What they will be is a bit of a mystery, though.
So like, do you believe that like you'll be married to your wife in the next life?
Not necessarily. As to whether we will have a special type of relational connection because of the marriage that we had here, possibly yes. But when David, talking about the Old Testament, loses his child with Bathsheba, I mean, he quite directly says, I will see you in the next life. Like, I'll see you, my son. And so I think that there's a belief, a pretty wide-held belief, though it is in that realm of mystery, that those family relationships that we've had here on earth will be experienced in a unique and a special way in the next life. As to how that all plays out, it is mysterious. I think we would say conclusively, based on, and yeah, you're 100% right, a responsible handling of conclusions that we arrive at from scriptures are best cross-referenced in multiple places, sort of the meta messaging on a specific topic. That's why we have systematic theology and things of that nature, to look at what all of scripture says about one specific topic. So to that point then, I think that we would quite conclusively say, well, we don't necessarily believe that we will be married in a procreative sense in the next life. As to what that connection and relationship will be like, though, it's pretty mysterious, and that's left in that realm of mystery. Now, one thing I will touch on, though, so to talk about this more from that more theological, doctrinal, biblical standpoint, looking at what is the overall messaging surrounding marriage, surrounding husband and wife relationships. That is precisely why, when we look at what we believe the collective messaging is in the scriptures, is why in our paradigm we don't embrace plural marriage.
What do you mean by the collective messaging? I'm curious.
So whether we're talking about Old Testament or New Testament, it seems to us that marriage is, when we're talking about principles surrounding marriage in Genesis, that a man will leave his mother and father to be joined with his wife. Almost anytime something is taught on marriage, it is taught about in a one-to-one singular fashion. Whenever it's commanded, whenever Jesus is sort of ratifying marriage and he's talking about, divorce and a few other things, it's, don't disrupt what God has joined together. And he ties that to what we interpret as a one man, one woman. That carries through into even the New Testament when instruction is given in Timothy to the church in Ephesus or in Titus, that the leaders should be, one man and one woman. Right. In Ephesians chapter 5, it seems to be speaking of the relationship between a man and a woman. So we see a more singular form of man and woman being used, where then we look in the Old Testament and we see that an ancient Near Eastern practice of polygamy was normative at that time. In patriarchal societies that weren't just tied to, guys wanting to have romantic connections with 7 women, but oftentimes the whole kinsman redeemer aspects of a brother taking his deceased brother's wife in because they were oftentimes uneducated and they couldn't fend for themselves. So we feel that there were more cultural, contextual dynamics that the Lord was able to work within, in the same way that he worked with a murderer, with Moses, and a liar, deceiver, and a murderer in David. And it's not that the use of these men who are practicing these things make those behaviors prescriptive, to use the term I used earlier, but more just descriptive of the context within which God was working in. But when it comes to principles, we believe the principles are from the entirety of the the Old Testament and the New Testament, to us seem to be pretty clearly one man, one woman. So that would be our position.
So can I push back on your thought about how plural marriage was descriptively in the Bible, but not really prescriptively, and it doesn't seem to be with divine endorsement so much as that he kind of dealt with it because it was part of the culture. I mean, am I capturing what you said?
For the most part, I think maybe a passage I could tie it to is that the Lord can use anything for the good of those who are walking in faith with him. So Yeah, even where there might be, where they're demonstrating aspects of their fallenness, for example, entering into a less than ideal marital situation in a plural marriage or a polygamous standpoint, it's basically God saying, I can work with this.
Yeah. Kind of like you did with slavery, for instance, in the Old Testament, right?
There's an acknowledgement of it, and he worked within the context of it being part of the cultural reality.
Yeah.
That doesn't mean that he endorsed it in a sense of it. He was commanding it.
Yeah, so I guess a few places in the Bible I'd like to know your thoughts on, right?
Yeah.
So, for instance, the fact that, and this in my mind is a really important contrast to like the slavery counter argument. It's like, well, slavery was also an institution that God worked through, but it's like, yeah, but slavery is always trying to get people out of, right? The redemption story of Israel, getting them out of Egyptian bondage, and slavery is always the counterpoint to the freedom that Christ offers, right? Conversely, like polygamy is something that God actually worked in covenantally through the family of Jacob to bring about the redemption of his children, right? Like he's not just not condemning it. He's like working with it as a vehicle of redemption. That's point one. And then point two is like in 2 Samuel, when Nathan, speaking for God, says, David, like God gave you Saul's wives. But what would you say to this idea that God gave David Saul's wives and that God worked through the family of Jacob as the vehicle of redemption, not just, you know what I'm saying? Like it seems more than he's just dealing with what was in the culture. It seems like he's actually infusing it with the sacred and like using that to bring about his covenantal purposes. I don't know.
Yeah, I think our response, the way we would contextualize that is say, yeah, that's how he does. That's how he works.
Okay.
The fact that I, as a pastor, I know me. I know my proclivities. I know my fallen nature. The fact that the almighty, holy, perfect God within whom there is no shadow still chooses to use a broken man like me to be a herald of his good news and his gospel as his image bearer is the scandal of God in his covenantal faithfulness, loving his image bearers and using us. So I see it more as, and you and I were at a conference recently with N.T. Wright, and he was sort of touching on this. Yeah. That's tied to the Imago Dei. This is tied to the image of God. Yeah. Whereas in an unbroken Edenic sense, we are made to be in God's presence in this unbroken fellowship because he means for us to be his representatives to this created realm. Yeah. We have dominion here. That is the original design. And where with agency, there is a marring of that image. And we are, in a lot of ways, because of the sin nature we now have, defective. It doesn't disqualify the Imago Dei. It doesn't disqualify our image-bearing status. So the fact that he's still willing to use the adulterous nation of Israel, who time and time again built their Asherah poles and worshiped Baal, and even after they were, the northern kingdom was exiled to Assyria, and the southern kingdom still wasn't getting it, and he's sending prophet after prophet in, and they are adulterous in every sense of the word. Yeah. That is the power of the prophecies of Isaiah and Jeremiah and Ezekiel that says, even in your harlotry, I will still bring redemption to the world through you. So to me, that's how God works. And the fact that Jesus Christ himself comes through the line of David, through the line of Rahab, through the line of
several polygamists,
and several murderers and several, idol worshipers. So the way I answer that, and sorry, I got a little preachy there. It's kind of good, man. Preachers be preaching. That's the beauty in my mind of how God uses our brokenness and fallenness to still accomplish his perfect will.
Would you feel comfortable saying that the Bible never condemns polygamy and that God works through polygamy? And that oftentimes the moral value of polygamy needs to come from outside the Bible, and that we often need to say, well, it's a fallen, broken thing that God worked with. Whereas with monogamy, we wouldn't say that because that's the Adam and Eve Genesis 2 image, right? It seems like in order to theologically make the point that God is working through a very fallen, broken thing called polygamy, that has to come from outside the Bible and us imposing it onto the text, because I can't find it in the text anywhere where it's condemned. You have Timothy, you have Titus talking about how bishops need to be, church leaders need to have one wife. That's a very specific context. Matthew 19, when Jesus is talking about one man, one woman, he's pushing it back against divorce, not polygamy, right? Like I can't find anywhere in the scriptures where it's condemned. That doesn't mean it's endorsed, but it just seems like we have to make a theological decision, and then put that onto the text. Would you agree with that?
There's a lot of things that aren't directly prohibited in the scriptures that we would look at what other principles are taught in the scriptures to say, well, you know what? Even though the Lord doesn't explicitly say no to abortion, and that can be a tricky topic too. If we take the social inferences and all the complications that come with abortion, I don't want to make a broad statement. However, knowing that that is a ethical and moral issue that's consistently discussed in faith circles, the fact that he doesn't explicitly prohibit it doesn't mean that there isn't enough taught elsewhere on the sanctity of life and other things that give a strong position to those who say we probably shouldn't do it. And I think that's where I would stand with polygamy, even though he doesn't specifically condemn it. For us, the overarching principles when it ties to marriage seem to indicate to us that that is one man, one woman for life.
And I would add, too, that in our discourse, there's such a thing as righteous plural marriage and unrighteous plural marriage. Abraham and Jacob are endorsed as righteous. David and Solomon are endorsed as abusing the principle. And the very revelation that we've talked about, section 132, does contain some strong condemnations of the ways that the practice can be abusive. If we look at the historical record, there were some plural marriages that were very happy and very loving. There were some that were abusive, just like monogamous marriage, right? It doesn't seem like it transcended that category. But we wouldn't throw the baby out with the bathwater, basically, in here and saying, hey, there's no marriage after this life, or that marriage is bad just because some marriages are bad too. So I guess what we're saying is you could take the same set of principles from the Bible and come back and say, hey, under certain circumstances, it seemed like it was allowable and even endorsed and even used as a tool for God to carry out his will, accepting that I am 100% in agreement with you about what you said so eloquently about God using broken vessels to accomplish his work. We don't think anybody in the scriptures was perfect except for Jesus Christ himself, and everybody had some defect or flaw, and God worked through that. But at the same time too, we think that the principles and the reading of the scripture doesn't lead us to one conclusion or the other unless you have further revelation. And so the further revelation, which we believe comes through the Book of Mormon and the Doctrine and Covenants and the Pearl of Great Price, does kind of answer some of those questions that remain a little bit nebulous.
And I would say, even though I disagree with that, that's where I say, okay, good, that actually starts to make sense to me now, even though I don't agree with it. The continuing revelation, the ongoing teaching and clarification and refinement of the understanding of these ideas, practices, and principles in your context, that makes sense to me. You have D&C 132. You have, and let's talk about this now, you have other prophets and teachers speaking to it when it was being practiced, and also speaking to it when there was a manifesto that was proclaimed by the church in 1890. Let's talk about that a little bit. How did this practice take place for decades and then suddenly stop in 1890? Like what happened there? All I know is that it stopped in 1890. I don't know exactly the circumstances surrounding it.
I wouldn't say it suddenly stopped.
It's over one day, but it's messy.
Yeah, back to, do you want to?
Well, there's two principles at play here. Number one, we believe in plural marriage. Everybody believes in it in principle, even if only a small number of church members are practicing it. But another principle we believe in is honoring, obeying, and sustaining the law. That's one of the 13 articles of faith that Latter-day Saints believe in too. In the United States, we believe that plural marriage as a religious principle was protected under the American Constitution. However, the United States Congress passed more and more stringent laws forbidding the practice of plural marriage, and sometimes even forbidding cohabitation. And those laws got more and more stringent, particularly in the aftermath of the American Civil War, and Latter-day Saints were willing to test the validity of those laws. Like a guy named George Reynolds, actually, who was sealed to 2 women, agreed to be arrested for practicing plural marriage, and the case went all the way up to the Supreme Court and was upheld. And so in the language that makes up the Manifesto, the 1890 language, the President of the Church, Wilford Woodruff, said specifically, inasmuch as laws have been passed by Congress forbidding plural marriage, and these laws have been upheld by the court of last resort, he then said, my advice to the Latter-day Saints is to refrain from entering into new plural marriages. Again, they still have to deal with the fallout of what if you're already in a plural marriage?
Of course.
What about if we go to Mexico? Because that's outside the jurisdiction.
Yeah.
And some people did
Some people did that.
That was part of the fallout too, is the Manifesto said if it's against the law, we aren't going to practice it. But then the question is, what if it's legal in Mexico and Canada? And so it continued for about 15 years after, until what's known as the Second Manifesto was given. And the Second Manifesto basically had teeth, I guess you'd say. It said, if you enter into a plural marriage or you perform a plural marriage, you'll be excommunicated from the church.
That's when it was like 1904.
Case closed.
Yeah, but you still had Latter-day Saints who were living in plural marriages into the 1940s. The last president of the church who had entered into plural marriages was Heber J. Grant, who was president of the church from 1918 to 1945.
Oh, wow. Okay.
He wasn't practicing plural marriage when he was president of the church, because he was sealed to 3 women and 2 of them had passed away. So he was monogamous the entire time he was the leader of the church.
I see.
But, even the president of the church today, we believe, is sealed to more than one person. And
Right.
so that principle remains. And again, the end's a lot messier than sometimes we make it. But in any type of history, you tell the simplified story for beginners, and then you get into the complicated story, and almost every story is more complex than.
So from the 1860s, when the first legislation was passed, all the way to 1904.
Yeah.
It's how long it took to
Really?
finally end it. Yeah.
Okay, so then help me then, again, as an outsider. Who is John Taylor?
Okay.
And what role did he play in this narrative? I know he was a president of the church, right?
He was. Yeah.
Was it during the Manifesto?
Yeah, John Taylor is the president of the church probably during the time that anti-polygamy sentiment in the country becomes most severe.
Okay.
So Joseph Smith introduces it, but not publicly. Brigham Young does introduce it publicly and suffers some persecution because of it. But really, the American Civil War and other things were
a distraction.
Yeah, they had bigger fish to fry than us.
Yeah.
John Taylor is the president of the church after Brigham Young. Okay. And at this point, the Civil War has ended. Republicans are focusing their efforts on ending the other relic of barbarism, and they've passed these laws. John Taylor felt very strongly that Latter-day Saints should resist the law, to the extent that even during the last few years of his leadership, he went underground and moved from place to place so that he wouldn't be arrested.
There's bounty on his head. There's you can still find wanted posters online if you want. He's.
And I know we're kind of doing a flashback here based on something you said a minute ago, because you were saying a minute ago that we believe that following the laws of the land is important, whereas he was saying, not so fast.
Kind of in the Acts 3, Acts 2, where Peter's like, hey, should I obey the laws of God or the laws of man?
Okay.
It's kind of one of those, So.
It's one of those situations where he felt like if we hung on and exercised faith, eventually something would happen.
Okay.
Some miracle would occur. And so the last few years of his presidency, our general conferences were held we're going to have General Conference of Provo, and everybody would show up, and then everybody would scatter. And in the first presidency, Joseph F. Smith, went to Hawaii, where he was outside of American jurisdiction. George Buchanan, who was the first consul in the first presidency, was trapped by federal marshals on a train and jumped off the train and was badly injured and placed in prison for practicing plural marriage. And John Taylor actually dies in exile under these conditions. Then the next president of the church to come in is Wilford Woodruff, and he's the one who issues the Manifesto, which is the beginning of the end of the practice of plural marriage.
Okay. We don't have to get into the nitty-gritty, but there have been recent news stories coming out that the church has acknowledged the existence of, officially, something that was written down by John Taylor. tied to the practice of plural marriage. Help me understand what all of that dust up is about.
You want to take it? Or you want...
I mean, some of that is like internet hype.
Okay.
It's not brand new. The church didn't just barely acknowledge it.
Really?
The church recently put it online for people to be able to access the original. That's the new thing.
Yeah, the church is digitizing its holdings,
and it just happened to get to that file.
It was
already existed.
It was digitized and placed online, but we've known about the existence of the revelation for a long time. We did a podcast last year where we talked with an expert about it, and that was way before the digitization. Basically, what it is while John Taylor was in exile, he dictated a revelation that could be interpreted as saying the new and everlasting covenant is plural marriage, and that it's eternal, that it will always exist. Now, other people have read the exact same words and said the new and everlasting covenant is eternal marriage, and that's eternal, and that will always exist. Okay. And that seems like the more feasible interpretation, because not everybody in the church was practicing plural marriage, and today we don't practice plural marriage. So it seems like what turned out to be eternal was the marriage covenant and not the plural marriage clause of it that exists. And a lot of fundamentalists, which that's a whole other discussion, but fundamentalist is shorthand for people that believe that the church should still practice plural marriage. And they do still practice plural marriage.
But they are not considered part of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints.
Yeah, correct.
They are considered a separate group.
Yeah, they considered the revelations to Wilford Woodruff to be bunk, that he was just capitulating to government pressure and it wasn't a legitimate revelation, and that the true revelation is what John Taylor received, which is this should continue. And so they're saying from Wilford Woodruff on, the mainstream LDS church is off, and we are correct, right?
So help me understand then, there was evidently sometime in the 1930s, I think it was, where the church was saying, we don't know what you're talking about. This thing doesn't exist from John Taylor. I think that's what I've heard some people saying. It's like, well, why did they say it didn't exist in the 1930s? And now not only are they saying it exists, but they're putting it online.
Well,
did the church lie?
Yeah.
Well, that's the accusation, I suppose.
I guess that's the question. Is the church took a gentle approach towards fundamentalists until about the 1930s, and then they sort of put the hammer down and said no more. And that's when fundamentalists loudly broadcasted their claim that this revelation existed. The first presidency made a statement where they said they believed it was a false revelation. And there's a number of ways to interpret that. One could be it's a false revelation that John W. Taylor produced, and it was never the real deal. It never came from John Taylor. Another way to look at it is we don't believe in infallibility when it comes to the leaders of the church. So one way to look at it is that John Taylor believed in plural marriage and wanted plural marriage to endure, and the revelation was a product of John Taylor and not necessarily a communication of the mind of God. Another possibility is, like I said, that the revelation's just been misread, and the fundamentalists were using it to try and justify the continued practice of plural marriage when the revelation was discussing the eternal nature of the marriage covenant. And the third possibility is that John Taylor received it as a revelation, and revelations can be timely and apply to a specific moment in time, but it was never canonized or placed in the scriptures. Because if you're familiar with the Bible, which I know you are, you're familiar with the idea of canonization, and that not everything that purports to be scripture becomes scripture.
Okay. Yeah.
And Latter-day Saints, because we have an open canon, also have a complicated process to say, hey, if this revelation was received, A, was it genuine, and B, is it going to be something that we put into our canon and use as a measuring rod for other revelations as well? So it's complicated on all those levels too.
I think one thing is pretty clear about the John Taylor revelation, like he never presented this to the church. He never thought, hey guys, good news. I just got a revelation from the Lord that says we should stick to our guns and like this is going to, he didn't do that. It says that the everlasting covenant will never, how does he say it? Like, it'll never cease or never be withdrawn. Whatever that means, it was a private revelation to John Taylor. End of story.
We believe that not every statement made by a leader of the church represents the official position of the church. So for instance, when persecution over plural marriage was very intense, there were some leaders of the church that did say, that it was eternal, or that maybe a tougher point is that it was essential for exaltation. The leaders of the church now don't teach that, and the established teachings of the church are that neither one of those things is the case. But, one thing to be cautious with is 19th century Latter-day Saints would speak extemporaneously. Like it was a grand tradition in our church that a person would get up with no notes and talk, and that's why in a discourse of Brigham Young, you can hear some amazing theology, and then you can hear some stuff about how to irrigate your fields more efficiently.
Right, sure. I'm going to be honest with you. That helps the King Follett discourse make sense to me as well.
Yeah,
because he was very much, on one hand, he was speaking his planned statements, and he went off on a couple tangents here and there. So
yeah, and actually, I love that.
Yeah, sure.
But it also means that, like Scott said, what's been canonized, we would say, would take top priority.
Okay.
If somebody comes in and says, "Well, I found this in volume 23, page 172 of the Journal of Discourses," we would say, "Okay, we're not disputing that Brigham Young said that, but
Let's compare it to the canon.
let's compare it to the canon."
how do current members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, since you both speak for all of them, how do they view some of these sectarian offshoots of like the fundamentalists who still practice polygamy? What regard is held for these groups that still maintain that this is an eternal practice that we should be entering into?
I think it ranges, right, from
There's a
sympathy
spectrum.
to maybe a little
Fascination.
Yeah,
Disagreement.
disagreement across the board. Some sympathetic, like in their mind, they were just holding true to what they felt was absolutely fundamental. Government be damned, right? Like you come at us, like we will die on this hill, right? And then Wilford Woodruff was seen as capitulating. Joseph F. Smith was seen as capitulating, and so they did what integrity demanded, right, in their minds, right? And so, so there's a sympathy to
That
see
they're operating within their convictions,
Yeah.
even though there's a disagreement, and there's the belief that they are outside of the priesthood authority that exists.
because they went against the person who held the keys of the kingdom. Wilford Woodruff had the keys of the kingdom. He was fully authorized to make that change, and so was Joseph F. Smith in the Second Manifesto. So to go against two presidents of the church who are authorized, who held the same keys that Joseph Smith held when he introduced the practice, to now go against, you see the logic is like you can't have it one way, but and then switch it on the other. Like if the one who's holding the keys ends the practice, then that's authoritative, and so there's a strong disagreement on that point for sure. But
Which gets into, as I've perceived again as an outsider, sort of the messiness where that's where there's a problem in my mind for those who might say, well, Joseph never practiced it. It was Brigham Young and he was in error. Unfortunately, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints is sitting on that branch, and you cut off that branch of Brigham Young misappropriating, that practice, that becomes problematic.
And I've talked to some that can intellectually reconcile that can say, well, Brigham Young wasn't perfect.
Sure.
And I've kind of pushed back and said, yeah, but you're saying Brigham Young was
Lying.
in open opposition to Joseph Smith.
Right.
And at the root of a deep conspiracy that goes all the way through the first generation of the church. For me, that would be too much to accept. But when we're talking, I hope I'm not painting with too broad a brush here, but I would say the average Latter-day Saint looks at people that continue to practice plural marriage with, misunderstanding and maybe even fear on the same level that the average American would.
Well, this is not an easy topic to discuss, and I very much appreciate you guys talking through it with me. And I mean, even where it requires sort of a delicate discernment to kind of figure out how to best position things and represent things, it has helped me a lot, and I really hope and believe that it'll help a lot of people that are also maybe wrestling with these things, whether they're outside the church or inside the church. So
let's do it again sometime.
Yeah,
awesome.
Love it. Thank you.
All right, tell people again about your podcast.
So it's called Church History Matters, and we deal with all the complex issues in our church's history. So
you guys are the power lifters of podcasting in the LDS world. You're not. This is not light lifting.
No, we're
we love
reckless.
this, and it's such a blessing to have an intelligent. I was going to say sparring partner, but
That's not too far off. That's not too far off.
Some days it is, but most days it's more like we're equally yoked.
I think I've experienced that a little bit with Scott.
Yeah, it's good.
No, it's fun.
That's great. All right, so links in the description to access some of their content. If you like this video, hit the thumbs up, subscribe. You can support me on Patreon if you want to see a very extended version of this conversation. But you don't have to. Come back for more conversations. And until next time, I'll see you later, Saints.